There are some questions that should really never be asked out loud. These are questions where the answers are hidden deep under many years of silence, locked behind closed doors and inside burned letters. These are questions that, once someone speaks them, unravel entire lives just like a loose thread pulled from old, rotting fabric. In the spring of 1847, a young enslaved woman named Dinina asked one of those questions. She asked it only one time in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper, standing in the doorway of the big plantation house kitchen. The man she asked was the overseer, a cruel man named Horace Vance. He was found 3 days later swinging from the oak tree behind the horse stables with his own belt around his neck. His face was frozen in a look that witnesses would later say looked like he knew something terrible. But Dinina's question did not die with Vance. It spread through the slave quarters like a sickness, whispered in the tobacco fields, and murmured over cooking fires. As it spread, other secrets began coming to the surface. Secrets that had been carefully kept for nearly 20 years. Secrets that involved the master's family, the bloodlines of the plantation, and a truth so disturbing that it would eventually destroy everyone who touched it. This is the story of Thornhill Plantation in Laundenburg County, Virginia, where a simple question about looking alike became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror far worse than anyone could have guessed. Before we go on with the story of Thornhill Plantation and the question that destroyed it, I need you to do something. If this start has already given you chills, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, buried deep in America's darkest history, are what we uncover here every week. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's discover what Dinina saw that spring morning and why her question could never be answered safely. Thornhill Plantation covered nearly 800 acres of Virginia's rolling land. Its main house was a three-story structure with white columns that shined in the afternoon sun. The estate sat on land that had once been hunting grounds for the Saponi people before they were pushed west by settlers. By 1798, when Colonel James Fairchild bought the property with money made from the tobacco trade, no trace of the original people remained, except for the occasional arrowhead turned up by a plow. The plantation had belonged to the Fairchild family for nearly 50 years by the time our story starts. Colonel James had built the main house in 1802, bringing workers from Richmond to create a building that would show off the family's status to anyone who passed by. The house had a grand entrance hall with a curving staircase, a parlor on either side with marble fireplaces, a formal dining room that could seat 20 people, and upstairs, 6 bedrooms with tall windows that looked over the tobacco fields stretching toward the river. Behind the main house stood the outbuildings. The kitchen house was built separate to stop fire risks, the smokehouse where meat was cured, the dairy with its cool stone floor, the laundry where enslaved women spent their days over steaming tubs, the carriage house and stables, the overseer's small house, and beyond all of these, arranged in 2 rows, the slave quarters, rough wooden cabins with dirt floors and stone chimneys, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people. Colonel James Fairchild had died in 1825, leaving the plantation to his son, Edward's father, also named James. This second James Fairchild had run Thornhill for 7 years before dying suddenly in 1832 of a stroke that took him in the middle of the night, leaving him cold in his bed by morning. He was 41 years old. Edward Fairchild, then just 28, had inherited everything: the land, the house, the debts, and the 47 human beings whose names were listed in the estate list between the farm animals and the furniture. He had been married for 3 years to Catherine Whitfield, daughter of a Richmond merchant, and they had one baby daughter who would die of scarlet fever before her second birthday. By 1847, Edward was 43 years old and looked older. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly gray. His face had the worn look of a man who spent his days outdoors checking fields and accounts. He was not a tall man, perhaps 5'9", but he carried himself with the stiff posture of someone aware of his power. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in certain lights, and they rarely showed feelings. Catherine had died in 1838, giving birth to their only living child, a boy named Thomas. The birth had been hard, lasting nearly 2 days, and Catherine had bled too much afterward. The doctor from town had done what he could, but an infection set in. She lasted a week, burning with fever and confused, calling for her mother and crying about things that made no sense. Edward had sat with her every night, holding her hand, saying nothing. When she finally died, he had her buried in the family cemetery on the hill behind the house, beneath a marble stone carved with angels. Thomas was now 9 years old, a thin boy with his father's pale eyes and his mother's fine features. He was being taught by a tutor from Richmond, a strict man named Mr. Gaines, who believed in Latin, math, and harsh discipline. The boy showed skill for learning but little excitement. He spent his free hours reading in the library or walking the grounds, always alone, always quiet. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 47 people. That spring of 1847, the number changed slightly with births and deaths, occasional sales and purchases, but it had stayed close to 50 for the past 15 years. Most worked the tobacco fields that stretched from the main house to the river. Their days were measured by the sun and the overseer's watch. Tobacco was hard work. It needed constant attention from planting in April through harvest in September. And even in winter there was work to be done, pulling leaves, preparing beds for the next year's crop, fixing tools. Others worked in the house, the stables, the blacksmith shop, the kitchen. There was a rank system among the enslaved people, as there always was. House servants looked down on field workers. Skilled workers held higher status than common laborers. Those born on the plantation felt better than those bought from elsewhere. But these differences meant little in the end. They were all property, all subject to the same total power, all open to the same casual cruelties. Dinina was 19 years old that April, born on the plantation to a woman named Ruth, who had died of fever when Dinina was 12. Ruth had worked in the main house as a maid, responsible for cleaning the bedrooms, changing sheets, emptying chamber pots, and attending to the personal needs of the family. She had been a quiet woman, Dinina remembered, with sad eyes and gentle hands. She had taught Dinina to read secretly, dangerously, using a Bible she had somehow got, and had told her daughter stories about her own mother, who had been brought from Africa as a child, and who remembered the ocean trip in nightmares that lasted her whole life. Ruth had died in the summer of 1840 during a fever outbreak that killed 6 people on the plantation. Dinina, then 12 years old, had nursed her mother through the final days, wiping her burning forehead with cool cloths, giving her sips of water, listening to her confused talk. In those final hours, Ruth had said things that made no sense to the child Dinina. Apologies, warnings, names that meant nothing. She had held Dinina's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Dinina had not understood then. She understood now. After Ruth's death, Dinina had been moved to the kitchen to work under Bess, an older woman who had cooked for the Fairchilds for 30 years. Bess was perhaps 60 years old. She did not know exactly, as enslaved people rarely knew their exact ages. With gray hair, she kept wrapped in a cloth and hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts. She was the closest thing to a mother Dinina had after Ruth died, teaching her to cook, to manage the kitchen's routine, to navigate the dangerous waters of serving white people who could punish you for any small mistake. Dinina was quick with her hands, quiet in her manner, and had unusually sharp powers of observation, a trait that would prove both a gift and a curse. She noticed things, the way Edward Fairchild's jaw got tight when he was angry, the way Mr. Gaines's eyes stayed on the younger enslaved women, the way Horace Vance seemed to enjoy others' fear. She noticed patterns, connections, and people who looked alike. She had a brother named Samuel, 2 years younger, who worked in the stables. Samuel had been born in the summer of 1830, and from early childhood had been marked by his unusual looks. While most of the enslaved people at Thornhill had the deep brown skin common to their West African roots, Samuel's skin was noticeably lighter, what was sometimes called bright. At the time, or more cruelly, yellow. His features, too, were different. A narrow nose, thin lips, and those same pale gray eyes that marked the Fairchild family line. Such things were not rare on plantations throughout the South. Everyone knew what they meant, though no one spoke of it directly. Mixed-race children were a clear reminder of the violence and abuse that supported the entire system, and their presence was managed through silence and purposeful ignoring. Masters did not claim their enslaved children. White wives pretended not to notice, and the enslaved people themselves learned to keep quiet because speaking the truth could get you sold away or worse. But Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was more than a matter of color. As he grew from a boy to a young man, the likeness became impossible to ignore. He had Edward's build, tall and lean, with broad shoulders and long limbs. He had Edward's way of tilting his head when listening, as though thinking about what was being said from many angles. He had Edward's long fingers, Edward's straight posture, Edward's habit of rubbing his jaw when thinking. By 1847, at 17 years old, Samuel looked like he could have been Edward's son, which of course he was. Everyone at Thornhill knew it. The enslaved people had known since Samuel was a child, had watched Ruth's shame and silence, had understood what it meant. They knew that Ruth had been young and pretty when the old master, Edward's father, had taken notice of her. They knew that she had no choice, that no was not a word enslaved women could say to white men. They knew that Samuel was the result, and that Ruth had carried that heavy load until it killed her. Even the white workers, the overseer, the tutor, the occasional merchants who visited must have noticed. How could they not? Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was written on his face, in his build, in his movements. But knowing and speaking were different things entirely. The system depended on this silence. As long as no one said it out loud, as long as the truth remained unspoken, the lie could be kept up. Edward could continue as master, Samuel could continue as property, and the deep lie at the heart of the plantation could go on. The lie that said blood did not matter, that family did not matter, that a man could own his own brother, and it was perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable, until Dinina asked her question. The morning of April 23rd, 1847 began like any other. Dinina woke before dawn in the small cabin she shared with 3 other women. Mary, who worked in the laundry, Patience, who worked in the fields, and old Aunt Sarah, who was too old for heavy work now and spent her days fixing clothes and watching the small children while their mothers worked. The cabin was perhaps 12 feet square with a dirt floor and a single window covered with oiled paper. There were 2 narrow beds, rough wooden frames with rope supports and straw mattresses, and a fireplace where they cooked their own meals when they had time and food. Dinina dressed in the dark, pulling on the same dress she wore every day, rough cotton dyed brown, fixed in a dozen places. She wrapped her hair in a cloth, slipped her feet into worn shoes, and made her way through the early morning darkness to the kitchen house. The path from the quarters to the kitchen was well worn, a track through the grass that hundreds of feet had traveled thousands of times. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and growing things. Spring had come early that year, and the trees were already full of leaves, their branches dark against the lighting sky. Birds were beginning to sing, mockingbirds and cardinals and the harsh call of crows. Bess was already in the kitchen when Dinina arrived, as she always was. The older woman seemed to need less sleep as she got older, rising earlier and earlier, as though trying to stretch her remaining days. She had already built up the fire in the big fireplace, and the kitchen was warming up, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the lasting smell of yesterday's cooking. "Morning, child," Bess said without looking up from the dough she was working. "Morning, Aunt Bess." They worked in comfortable silence as they did most mornings. Bess worked on the bread while Dinina got water from the well, filled the large kettle and hung it over the fire to heat, brought in eggs from the chicken house, sliced ham from the meat hanging in the smokehouse. The kitchen was a separate building, perhaps 20 feet from the main house, connected by a covered walkway. It was built of brick, with a slate roof, designed to keep any fire contained. The main room held the huge fireplace with its hooks and cranes, a long work table, shelves of dishes and pots, barrels of flour and cornmeal, strings of onions and dried peppers hanging from the ceiling beams. By 6:00, they were preparing the breakfast that would be carried to the main house. Biscuits, ham, eggs, coffee, jams made from last summer's peaches. Young Thomas ate his breakfast in the dining room with his tutor at 7:00 sharp. This was Mr. Gaines's rule, part of the discipline he believed was needed for a boy's education. Edward ate later, usually around 8, in his study while reviewing the plantation's money books. The routine never changed, had been the same for years. Dinina could have done her tasks in her sleep, and sometimes felt that she did, moving through the motions while her mind went elsewhere. This morning, though, she was thinking about Samuel. Her brother had been in trouble again. 2 days ago, he had been caught near the main house after dark, where enslaved people had no business being after the workday ended. He claimed he had been looking for a lost tool, but Horace Vance did not believe him or did not care whether it was true. The overseer had announced that Samuel would receive 10 lashes as punishment to be given this afternoon in front of the other enslaved people as a lesson. 10 lashes. Dinina had seen whipping before, had heard the crack of the whip and the cries of pain, had seen the bloody stripes left on backs. 10 lashes was not the worst. Some people received 50, 100, beatings that left them unable to work for days. But 10 was enough to scar, enough to hurt, enough to shame, and for what? For walking near the house that his own father owned. For existing in a space where his presence reminded everyone of the truth they all pretended not to know. Around 8:00, Dinina was carrying a tray of fresh biscuits from the kitchen to the main house when she met Horace Vance on the path. The overseer was a heavy man of perhaps 50, with a red face always flushed from drink and sun, and small eyes that seemed always to be calculating. He wore rough work clothes, canvas pants, a cotton shirt, heavy boots, and carried a short whip coiled at his belt. Not the long whip used in the fields for driving workers, but a personal tool he used for what he called correction. Vance had been the overseer at Thornhill for 8 years, hired by Edward after the previous overseer died of a heart attack. He was effective, cruel, and completely without feeling. He saw the enslaved people as animals to be managed, and he managed them with fear. He had a reputation throughout the county as a hard man, someone who could handle difficult slaves, and Edward paid him well for his work. Vance stopped Dinina on the path, his large body blocking her way. He looked at the tray she carried, then at her face, his small eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Dinina," he said, his voice carrying a fake friendliness that was somehow worse than open hate. "Morning, Mr. Vance." She kept her eyes down as was expected. He reached out and took a biscuit from the tray without asking, bit into it, chewed slowly, crumbs caught in his beard. He was standing close enough that she could smell him. "Sweat and tobacco and something sour. Your brother is getting his lashes this afternoon," Vance said casually. 3:00 by the tobacco sheds. You will be there to watch, I expect. It was not a question. When punishment was given, everyone was expected to watch. It was part of the lesson. "Yes, sir," Dinina said quietly. "Good." Vance took another bite of biscuit. "Boy needs to learn his place, getting too proud, thinking he can wander where he pleases. Can't have that. Got to keep order, you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Your mama understood that. Ruth knew her place, knew how things worked. You would do well to be like her." He smiled, showing yellow teeth. "Pretty girl like you, smart girl. You could do well here if you keep your head down and your mouth shut." The meaning was clear, and it made Dinina's stomach turn. She said nothing, just stood there holding the tray, waiting for him to move. Finally Vance stepped aside. "Better get those biscuits to the house before they get cold. Master Edward don't like cold biscuits." Dinina hurried past him, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked toward the house. She entered through the back door into the warming kitchen, a small room where food was kept hot before serving. From there, a narrow hallway led past the butler's pantry to the dining room. As she got close with the tray, she heard voices. "Thomas and his tutor, Mr. Gaines." The dining room door stood slightly open. Dinina paused, not from curiosity but from training. Servants learned to pause before entering rooms, to listen for a moment, to check the mood, to avoid interrupting at a bad moment, to make themselves invisible until needed. Through the gap she could see Thomas seated at the long mahogany table, his Latin book open before him. The book looked huge in front of the small boy, its pages covered in dense text. Mr. Gaines stood beside him, one hand on the back of Thomas's chair, the other pointing to something on the page. The tutor was a thin man of perhaps 40, with a narrow face and dark hair combed strictly back. He wore a black suit, as he always did, and carried himself with the stiff certainty of a man who believed he knew God's will. Again, Mr. Gaines was saying the verb forms, first person, singular, present tense. Thomas's young voice was hesitant. Ammo, louder, speak with confidence. Ammo, amas, amat. The morning light from the tall windows fell across Thomas's face, lighting up his side profile. The sharp nose, the pale eyes, the thin mouth, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He was wearing a white shirt with a stiff collar, dark pants, shoes that had been polished to a shine, a child dressed as a small adult being shaped into the master he would someday become. And in that moment, Dinina thought of her brother, thought of Samuel, who at this very moment was probably cleaning out stalls in the stable, his hands rough and hard, his clothes stained with dirt and sweat. Samuel, who would be whipped that afternoon for the crime of walking near the house that his own father owned. Samuel, who had the same pale gray eyes as the boy sitting at that table, the same sharp nose, the same way of tilting his head. The likeness was striking. It always had been. But somehow, in this moment, with the morning light falling just so across Thomas's face, it was undeniable. They could have been brothers. They were brothers, half-brothers, sharing a grandfather, sharing Fairchild blood. But one sat at a mahogany table learning Latin, meant to inherit land and wealth and power, and the other cleaned stables and would be whipped for walking in the wrong place. The anger came suddenly, unexpectedly, a hot rush that rose from her chest to her throat. It was not a planned thing, not a calculated risk. It was simply the breaking point of years of gathered silence. Years of watching her mother's sadness, years of seeing Samuel treated as property while wearing the face of the family that owned him, years of swallowing truths that everyone knew but no one could say. Dinina pushed open the door and entered with the tray. Mr. Gaines glanced at her with the blank look white people saved for servants, seeing her job but not her face, noticing her presence only as one might notice a piece of furniture that had moved. Thomas did not look up from his book, still focused on his Latin words. Dinina set the tray on the side table and began arranging the biscuits on a serving plate. Her hands were shaking a little, though she tried to control them. The anger was still there, hot and demanding, wanting release. And then, in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear, she said, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" The room became very still. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear away, impossible to ignore. Dinina continued arranging the biscuits, her hands moving automatically, her heart beating so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Mr. Gaines turned slowly. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous, barely controlled. Dinina did not repeat it. She did not need to. The question had been heard, had been understood, and now it existed in the world, real and undeniable. Thomas looked up from his Latin book, his young face confused. "Which brother?" he asked with the innocent directness of a 9-year-old who did not yet understand why this question was forbidden. "Who does she mean? I didn't know she had a brother." Mr. Gaines's face had gone from pale to red. He took a step toward Dinina, one hand raised, then seemed to think better of it. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling fast beneath his black suit. "Get out," he said very quietly. "Get out now." Dinina left the tray, left the biscuits half-arranged, left the room. She walked through the hallway, through the warming kitchen, out the back door. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, as though she were watching herself from a distance. She crossed the yard to the kitchen house and went inside, closing the door behind her. Bess was at the work table rolling out dough for pies. She took one look at Dinina's face and set down her rolling pin. "Child, what did you do?" Dinina could not answer. She sat down on the kitchen's back step in the doorway and waited for the punishment to arrive. Her hands were still shaking. She held them together in her lap and stared at them, at the brown skin and rough palms, at the hands that looked like her mother's hands. What had she done? She had spoken the truth. That was all. She had asked a simple question, pointed out a simple fact. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? But she knew even as she sat there that there was nothing simple about it. She had broken the main rule. She had named the thing that must never be named. She had torn away the veil of silence that allowed the system to work, and now she would pay for it. Bess came and sat beside her on the step. The older woman did not say anything, just sat there, her presence a comfort. They waited together in silence, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up, voices calling, tools clanging, the distant sounds of cattle. After perhaps 20 minutes, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots on the path. Dinina knew who it was before she looked up. Horace Vance appeared at the kitchen door, his face redder than usual, his small eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been excitement. He was breathing hard as though he had been running. "You," he said, pointing at Dinina, "come with me now." Bess stood up quickly. "Mr. Vance, sir, she didn't mean nothing. She is just a foolish girl who don't know when to keep quiet. I said, come with me." Vance's hand moved to the whip at his belt, his fingers touching the coiled leather. Dinina stood. Her legs were steadier now, her mind clearer. Whatever was going to happen would happen. There was no point in fighting, no point in running. She had nowhere to run to. She followed Vance out of the kitchen, leaving Bess standing in the doorway, her face full of worry. They walked not toward the whipping post near the tobacco sheds, as Dinina had expected, but toward the main house. Vance led her around to the front entrance, something enslaved people never used, and up the steps to the wide porch with its white columns. The front door was huge, made of dark wood with brass handles. Vance opened it without knocking and pushed Dinina inside. The entrance hall was dim and cool after the bright morning sun. Dinina had been in this space before, of course, but always as a servant, always invisible, always moving quickly through on her way to do some task. Now being marched through by the overseer, she felt exposed, wrong, like a piece of furniture moved to the wrong place. The hall was grand, a black and white checkered marble floor, a curving staircase with a fancy railing, a crystal light fixture hanging from the high ceiling, portraits of Fairchild ancestors on the walls. To the left was the parlor, to the right the library, and straight ahead past the staircase was the door to Edward Fairchild's study. Vance brought her to that door and knocked sharply. "Enter." The study was a large room lined with books, dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. Edward sat behind it, his hands folded on the leather surface, his face hard to read. Mr. Gaines stood to one side, his face still pale, his hands held in front of him. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Vance pushed Dinina forward into the center of the room, putting her in front of the desk like a prisoner before a judge. "This is the one, sir," Vance said, "the one who spoke out of turn this morning." Edward looked at Dinina for a long moment. His pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, showed nothing. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but there was something in the set of his jaw the tension in his shoulders that suggested controlled rage. "Repeat what you said," Edward ordered. His voice was level, quiet, but it carried total power. Dinina's mouth was dry. She tried to speak and could not. Her tongue felt thick, useless. "I said, repeat it." Edward's voice remained level, but something cold moved beneath it, like ice beneath still water. "I asked." Dinina's voice came out as a whisper. She swallowed and tried again. "I asked why young master looks like my brother." The silence that followed was total. Even Vance seemed to hold his breath. The clock on the shelf ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Then Edward said very quietly, "Which brother?" "Samuel, sir. Samuel, who works in the stables." Edward's face did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or defeat. He looked at Mr. Gaines. "You heard this?" "I did, sir, in front of young Master Thomas. The boy asked questions. He wanted to know who she meant. Said he didn't know she had a brother." Edward nodded slowly. He was still looking at Dinina, his gaze steady and cold. "And what did you hope to achieve with this question? What did you think would happen?" Dinina did not answer. She did not know how to answer. She had not thought about results, had not planned anything. She had simply spoken. "Do you understand what you have done?" Edward continued. "Do you understand that you have upset the order of this household? That you have planted ideas in my son's mind that he is too young to understand? That you have broken every rule of proper behavior?" Still, Dinina said nothing. What could she say? That the question had been burning in her mind for years, that she was tired of the lie, that she wanted someone, anyone, to admit the truth. Edward stood up from his desk, walked around it, and came near her. He was not a tall man, but standing this close, he seemed to tower over her. She could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the tightness of his mouth. "Your mother knew her place," he said quietly. "Ruth understood how things worked. She never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn. She accepted her lot and lived her life accordingly." He paused. "You would do well to follow her example." The mention of her mother sparked something in Dinina. "My mother died sad and silent," she said, her voice stronger now. "She carried secrets that ate her from the inside. Is that what you want? More silence, more secrets?" Edward's hand moved so fast she did not see it coming. The slap caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side, making her ears ring. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "You will not speak to me in that tone," Edward said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "You will not question me. You are property. You exist because I allow it. Do you understand?" Dinina said nothing, just stood there with her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Edward turned to Vance. "Take her to the root cellar, lock her in. I will decide her punishment later." As Vance grabbed Dinina's arm and pulled her toward the door, Edward added, "And bring Samuel to me." The root cellar was entered through a heavy wooden door set at an angle against the ground behind the kitchen house. Vance pulled it open, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. He shoved Dinina toward the opening. "Down you go," he said. Dinina went down the steps carefully, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness. The cellar was perhaps 10 feet square with a low ceiling held up by wooden beams. The walls were stone, cool and damp. The floor was packed earth. Shelves lined the walls, holding barrels of apples and potatoes, jars of preserved vegetables, hanging bunches of dried herbs. The air smelled of earth and vegetables and something faintly rotten. Vance followed her down, holding a lantern. He hung it on a hook, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then he looked at her, his small eyes moving over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know," he said casually, "you are a pretty girl, smart too. It is a shame you don't know when to keep your mouth shut." He took a step closer. "Things could go easier for you if you were friendlier." Dinina backed away until she hit the stone wall. "Mr. Vance, hush now." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers rough against her skin. "No need to be scared. I am just saying you be nice to me, I will be nice to you. I could talk to Master Edward. Tell him you are sorry. Tell him it won't happen again. I got influence here." Dinina turned her face away from his touch. "Please don't." Vance's look hardened. "You think you are too good for me, is that it? You think because you can read and work in the house that you are better than the others." His hand moved to her throat, not squeezing, but resting there. "A threat. You are nothing. You are property, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." He held her there for a moment longer, his hand on her throat, his face close to hers. Then he stepped back, picked up the lantern, and headed for the steps. "You think about what I said," he called back. "Think about whether you want a friend or an enemy." He climbed the steps and slammed the door shut. Dinina heard the heavy bolt slide into place, locking her in. The darkness was total. The cellar had no windows, no source of light except what came through the cracks around the door, and that was tiny. Dinina stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, but there was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was complete. She felt her way along the wall until she found a corner, then sat down on the dirt floor, her back against the cold stone. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small, and she waited. Time passed strangely in the darkness, without light, without sound, except the faint creaking of the floorboards above. Dinina lost track of how long she had been there. It might have been an hour, might have been 3. Her eyes played tricks on her, showing her shapes and shadows that were not there. Her mind wandered, drifting between memory and imagination. She thought about her mother, about Ruth's final days. The fever had come on suddenly, as it often did. One day, Ruth had been fine, working in the house as usual. The next day, she was burning up, confused, unable to stand. Dinina had been 12 years old, old enough to help nurse her, but too young to understand that her mother was dying. Ruth had said strange things in those final days. She had talked about the ocean, though she had never seen it. That was her own mother's memory, passed down. She had talked about a man with pale eyes who had taken something from her that she could never get back. She had apologized over and over, though Dinina did not know what for, and she had warned Dinina, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Dinina understood now what her mother had meant. Ruth had been violated, used, forced to bear a child to a man who owned her, and she had lived with that shame and silence for 17 years, watching her son grow up bearing the face of his father, knowing that everyone knew, but no one could say. It had eaten her from the inside, had killed her as surely as the fever had, and now Dinina had broken that silence. She had said aloud what everyone knew. She had asked the question that should never be asked. What would happen to Samuel? Edward had ordered him brought to the study. What would the master do to his own son, his own brother's son, now that the truth had been spoken aloud? Dinina's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from above. Footsteps, fast and heavy, voices raised in alarm, more footsteps running, shouts. Something was happening. She stood up, felt her way to the steps, climbed them, and pressed her ear against the door. The sounds were muffled but clear enough. People running, people shouting, a woman screaming, then cutting through all the other sounds, a scream unlike any Dinina had ever heard. A man's voice raw with terror and pain, screaming words she could not quite make out. The screaming went on and on, rising and falling, sometimes forming words, "No, no, please, God, no," and sometimes just pure sound, the sound of someone in terrible pain. Then it stopped suddenly, cut off mid-cry. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming had been. Dinina pressed her forehead against the door, her heart racing. What had happened? Who had been screaming? Was it Samuel? Had Edward done something terrible to him? She pounded on the door. "Hello? Someone? What is happening? Please?" No one answered. The sounds above had changed. No more running, no more shouting, just low voices, urgent and frightened, and the sound of something heavy being dragged. Dinina pounded again harder. "Please let me out. What is happening?" Still no answer. She gave up and returned to her corner, sat down, wrapped her arms around herself. She was shaking, though whether from cold or fear, she could not tell. Hours passed. The sounds above gradually returned to normal. Footsteps, voices, the routine sounds of the plantation day continuing, but no one came to the cellar. No one brought her food or water. No one checked on her. The darkness pressed in. Dinina slept poorly, woke, slept again. She was thirsty, hungry, terrified. She thought of Samuel, wondered if the screaming had been him, wondered what Edward had done. She thought of her mother, wondered if Ruth was watching from wherever the dead went, wondered if she approved or disapproved of Dinina's question. She thought about truth and silence, about the cost of speaking and the cost of staying quiet. She had broken the silence, and now everything was falling apart. But hadn't it been falling apart all along? Hadn't the lie been eating away at everything, rotting the foundation, poisoning everyone it touched? More time passed. Dinina lost track of whether it was day or night. In the total darkness of the cellar, time became meaningless. Finally, it might have been 6 hours later, might have been 12. She heard the bolt slide back. The door opened and light flooded in, painfully bright after so long in darkness. Dinina shielded her eyes, squinting against the glare. A figure stood outlined in the doorway. As Dinina's eyes adjusted, she saw it was Bess holding a candle, her face wet with tears. "Come on, child," Bess said softly. "Come on out of there." Dinina climbed the steps on shaking legs, her muscles stiff from sitting so long. She came out into what looked to be late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. She had been in the cellar for perhaps 8 hours. "What happened?" Dinina asked. "I heard screaming. Was it Samuel? Where is he?" Bess shook her head, fresh tears falling down her cheeks. "Samuel is gone, child. They took him away this afternoon, sold him to a trader heading south. He is gone." The words hit Dinina like a physical blow. "Sold, but hush now, that ain't the worst of it." Bess took Dinina's arm, steadying her. "Mr. Vance is dead." Dinina stared at her, unable to process the words. "What?" "They found him an hour ago hanging from the oak tree behind the stables. Used his own belt. His face..." Bess shuddered. "Lord have mercy. His face. They say his face looked like he had seen something terrible, like he had seen the devil himself." The death of Horace Vance sent shockwaves through Thornhill Plantation. The enslaved people gathered in small groups, whispering, guessing, afraid. The white workers, the few hired men who helped with special tasks, kept to themselves, their faces pale and frightened. And Edward Fairchild locked himself in what remained of his study, seeing no one, speaking to no one. The body had been discovered by Jacob, the old man who tended the horses. He had gone to the stables around 4:00 to begin the evening feeding, and had found Vance hanging from the massive oak tree that grew behind the building. The overseer's belt was wrapped around his neck, the other end tied to a low branch. His feet were perhaps 6 inches off the ground, his face purple and swollen, his eyes bulging. But it was the look on that face that had sent Jacob running for help, screaming because Vance's face, despite the changes of death, showed not pain or sadness, but something else entirely. His mouth was open in what might have been a scream, his eyes wide with what looked like recognition, as if in his final moments he had seen something, understood something that had filled him with such horror that death had been better than living with that knowledge. The county sheriff, a heavy man named Dawes, had been called from town. He looked at the body, looked at the scene, questioned everyone who might have seen or heard something. His conclusion was simple. Suicide. Vance had climbed the tree, tied his belt to the branch, and jumped. These things happened. Men sometimes took their own lives for reasons known only to themselves. But Sheriff Dawes could not explain why a man like Vance, brutal, practical, seemingly without conscience, would suddenly kill himself. He could not explain the look on the dead man's face. He could not explain why Vance's personal items, when checked, showed no sign of despair or planning, no note, no settling of affairs, no sign that he had been thinking about death. The enslaved people had their own ideas whispered in the quarters after dark. Some said it was God's judgment, payback for Vance's cruelty. Some said it was Ruth's ghost come back to avenge her children. Some said it was something darker, something that had been awakened by Dinina's question, by the speaking of truth that should have remained silent. Old Aunt Sarah, who claimed to have the sight, said she had seen Vance's ghost already, walking near the stables, his neck bent at a weird angle, his face still wearing that look of terrible knowledge. Others claimed to have heard sounds at night, footsteps, whispers, the creak of rope against wood. Edward Fairchild ordered Vance buried quickly in the far corner of the plantation's small cemetery, away from the family plots. The funeral was quick, a few words from a traveling preacher, no mourners except those required to be there. The grave was filled in, a simple wooden cross placed at the head, and everyone tried to pretend that life would return to normal. But life at Thornhill would never be normal again. Within a week, Edward hired a new overseer, a younger man named Porter, perhaps 35 years old, who came with good references from a plantation in Chesterfield County. Porter was less openly brutal than Vance had been, but no less effective. He believed in control through fear, in keeping absolute power, in showing no weakness. He lasted exactly 9 days. On his 9th night at Thornhill, Porter was making his evening rounds, checking that all the enslaved people were in their quarters, that no one was where they shouldn't be. He carried a lantern and a pistol, and he walked with the confidence of a man who feared nothing. He went to the stables last, as was his habit, to check on the horses and make sure the building was secure for the night. Jacob, who slept in a small room attached to the stables, heard him enter, heard his footsteps on the wooden floor, heard him speaking to the horses in a low voice. Then Jacob heard something else, a gasp, a choked cry, the sound of the lantern hitting the floor, then silence. Jacob, frightened, stayed in his room with the door barred. He did not come out until morning, when he found Porter standing in the center of the stable, his face pale as death, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. The lantern lay on the floor, its glass broken, the oil soaked into the straw. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting. "Mr. Porter," Jacob said carefully, "You all right, sir?" Porter turned to look at him, and Jacob took an automatic step back. The overseer's face was wrong somehow. Not hurt, not marked, but wrong, as if he had aged 10 years in a single night. "The tree," Porter whispered, The oak tree, he is still there, still hanging, still watching. Ain't nobody there, Mr. Porter. Mr. Vance is buried. I saw him. Porter's voice rose to a shout. I saw him hanging there, his face. He could not continue. He pushed past Jacob and ran from the stable. By noon, Porter had packed his things and left Thornhill, refusing to explain, refusing to stay even one more night. He rode away on his horse, looking back over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Edward tried to convince him to stay, offered him more money, but Porter would not even discuss it. There is something wrong with this place, he said. Something evil. I won't stay here. I won't end up like Vance. And he was gone. Edward hired a third overseer, a hard man from North Carolina named Garrett, and warned him about the foolish beliefs among the enslaved people. Garrett laughed and said he did not believe in ghosts. He had been managing slaves for 20 years, he said, and he had never seen anything that could not be explained by natural causes. He lasted 2 weeks. On his final night at Thornhill, Garrett was found at dawn walking the tobacco fields, his clothes torn, his hands bleeding, his face scratched as though he had been running through thorns. He was muttering to himself, his words barely understandable. The boy, he kept saying, the boy in the stables, the eyes, the same eyes. He knows what was done, he knows. They brought him to the house, tried to calm him, tried to get him to explain what had happened, but Garrett could not or would not say. He just kept muttering about eyes and knowing and the boy in the stables. By midday, he had recovered enough to pack his things. He left that afternoon without collecting his pay, without saying goodbye, without looking back. After that, Edward could not find anyone willing to serve as overseer. Word had spread through the county. Thornhill Plantation was cursed, haunted, wrong. 3 overseers in less than a month, 1 dead, 2 driven away by something they could not, or would not name. No amount of money was worth that risk. The enslaved people, left largely unsupervised, continued their work out of habit and fear. They knew that if the plantation failed, they would be sold away, families split up, lives destroyed. So they worked the fields, cared for the animals, kept up the buildings, kept the routines going. But the strict control that had once ruled Thornhill had broken. Without an overseer, without constant watching, the rigid structure began to crack, and Thomas Fairchild, now 10 years old, had begun asking questions. The questions started innocently enough. Thomas asked Bess, the cook, about the boy who used to work in the stables. He asked old Jacob where Samuel had gone. He asked the other enslaved people if they knew anything about his mother's family, about his grandfather, about the history of the plantation. Most of them avoided his questions, gave vague answers, tried to avoid talking with the boy. But Thomas was persistent. He had his father's intelligence and his father's stubbornness, and Dinina's question had planted a seed in his mind that would not stop growing. He came to the kitchen often, always when Bess was elsewhere, always finding Dinina. At first, she tried to avoid him, afraid of what might happen if she was caught speaking to the master's son. But Thomas was insistent, and slowly, carefully, she began to tell him things. Not everything, not the full truth that Edward had told her in his study, but pieces of it, parts that a 10-year-old mind could grasp. She told him about Samuel, about how kind he had been, how he had carved little animals from wood and given them to the younger children in the quarters. She told him about their mother Ruth, who had died of fever, who had been gentle and sad. She told him in careful words that sometimes masters had children with enslaved women, and those children were born into slavery despite their father. Thomas listened with a focus that was upsetting in one so young. He asked questions that showed he understood more than he should. But if a master has a child with a slave woman, isn't that child his son or daughter? Doesn't that make them family by blood? Yes, Dinina said carefully, but not by law. The law says the child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is enslaved no matter who the father is. But that isn't fair. No, young master, it isn't fair. And Samuel, he was your brother, your full brother, yes, and he looked like me. Dinina paused, then nodded. Yes, he looked like you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his young face troubled. Why did he look like me? This was the dangerous question, the one Dinina could not answer directly. You would have to ask your father that, young master. I did ask him. He won't tell me. He says I am too young to understand, that I shouldn't worry myself with such matters. Thomas looked at her with those pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes. But I do understand. I understand that Samuel was my uncle, that he was my grandfather's son, that he was family, and father sold him anyway. Dinina said nothing. What could she say? The boy had worked it out himself, had put the pieces together. He was 10 years old, and he understood the deep horror at the heart of his world. It is wrong, Thomas said quietly, all of it. It is wrong. Yes, Dinina agreed. It is wrong. And slowly over the course of those summer talks, Dinina watched something change in the boy's face. The innocence was leaving him, being replaced by a knowledge that no child should have to carry. He was beginning to understand what he was part of, what his family had done, what his very existence meant. He was beginning to understand that he was both victim and gainer of a system built on lies and violence, that his comfort came at the cost of others' suffering, that his inheritance was built on stolen lives and broken families. And that knowledge was destroying him. On the night of August 27th, Thomas Fairchild disappeared. Edward discovered it at breakfast when the boy did not appear. Thomas was usually on time, appearing in the dining room at 7:00 sharp as Mr. Gaines had trained him. When he did not come down, Edward sent a house servant to check on him. The servant returned with worrying news. Thomas's bed was unslept in. His window was open, and the boy was nowhere to be found. Edward's reaction was immediate and frantic. He gathered every enslaved person on the plantation, lined them up in front of the main house, and demanded to know if anyone had seen Thomas. His voice, usually so controlled, was rough with fear. If anyone knows where my son is, speak now. If anyone has helped him, hidden him, hurt him, speak now, and your punishment will be less severe than if I find out later. No one spoke. No one knew anything. The enslaved people looked at each other confused and frightened. Thomas had vanished, and no one had seen or heard anything. Edward sent riders to neighboring plantations, to the town of Londenburg, to the river crossings. He offered a reward for information, $50, a huge sum. He questioned everyone again individually this time, but no one knew anything. Days passed. The search grew to cover the whole county. Neighbors joined in, organizing search parties to comb the woods and fields. The sheriff returned, bringing deputies, searching for any sign of the missing boy. But Thomas had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. Edward was beside himself. He did not sleep, barely ate, spent his days and nights searching, calling his son's name, praying to a God he had never particularly believed in. The plantation's work came to a stop as everyone focused on finding the missing boy. On the third day, Dinina came to Edward's study. She knocked on the door, waited for permission to enter, and stepped inside. Edward looked up from his desk, his face tired, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "What is it?" His voice was rough. "I know where he is," Dinina said. Edward stood up so quickly his chair fell over backward. "Where?" "The old slave cemetery, past the tobacco fields near the woods." Edward stared at her. "Why would he be there?" "Because I told him about it, about the people buried there, about—" She paused. "About his grandmother, Ruth." Edward's face went white. "You told him?" "He asked about Samuel's mother. I told him the truth. I told him where she was buried." For a moment, Dinina thought Edward might strike her again. His hand tightened into a fist, his whole body tense. But then he seemed to collapse, all the anger draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion and sadness. "Show me," he said quietly. They walked together through the tobacco fields, past the worksheds, into the woods. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows. Birds sang in the branches overhead, ignoring the human drama. The old slave cemetery was perhaps a quarter-mile into the woods in a small clearing. It was where the enslaved people buried their dead away from the white cemetery near the main house. The graves were marked by rough wooden crosses and fieldstones, most of them worn and leaning. The names were remembered only in the memories of the living, passed down through spoken stories, because enslaved people were not allowed headstones with writing. They found Thomas sitting beside one of the graves, his back against a tree, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He had been there for 3 days, seemingly, sleeping in the woods, drinking from the creek, eating nothing. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face scratched from branches, his lips cracked from thirst. When he saw Edward, he did not move. He just looked at his father with those pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, Edward's eyes, and said, "She is buried here, Ruth, my grandmother." Edward stopped several steps away as though afraid to come closer. "Thomas, you need to come home." "Why?" The boy's voice was flat without feeling. "So I can pretend I don't know, so I can grow up and own my own cousins and half-siblings and pretend it is normal. Thomas." Samuel was my uncle. Thomas stood up, his small body shaking. "My uncle and my half-brother both, and you sold him. You sold your own son, your own brother's son, and you didn't even care. It is not that simple." "Yes, it is." Thomas's voice rose to a shout, echoing through the trees. "It is exactly that simple. You did it. Grandfather did it, and now I am supposed to do it too, aren't I? That is what you are teaching me. That is what all of this is for. So I can grow up and do the same things, own people, sell people, pretend they are not human." Edward took a step forward. "You don't understand. You are too young to understand how the world works. I understand that it is wrong." Thomas was crying now, his words coming in gasps. "I understand that we are monsters, that our whole family is built on being monsters, that everything we have, everything we are is built on hurting people and pretending it is normal." Edward reached for his son, but Thomas jerked away. "Don't touch me. You are not my father. You are just a man who owns people, who owns his own children, who sold his own brother." The boy turned and ran, not toward the house, but deeper into the woods. Edward called after him, But Thomas did not stop, did not look back. He vanished into the trees, leaving Edward standing alone among the graves. Dinina, who had watched the whole scene from a few steps back, said quietly, "Let him go. He will come back when he is ready." Edward turned on her, his face twisted with rage and grief. "This is your fault. You did this. You destroyed my son with your questions and your truths." "No," Dinina interrupted, her voice steady. "You destroyed him. You and your father and all the men like you. You built a world on lies and violence, and now your son can see it for what it is. I didn't do that. I just made him see what was already there." Edward raised his hand as if to hit her, then let it fall. He looked suddenly old, beaten, broken. The master of Thornhill Plantation, who had controlled so much, who had held such power, stood among the graves of the people his family had owned, and looked like a man who had lost everything. "Get back to the house," he said quietly. Dinina turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone among the unmarked graves, calling his son's name into the quiet woods. Thomas returned to the house that evening, silent and empty-eyed. He went to his room and locked the door. Edward tried to speak with him, standing in the hallway, begging through the locked door, but the boy would not answer. The next morning, Thomas came out and started his daily routine as though nothing had happened. But something deep had broken in him. He moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, his face showing nothing. He ate his meals in silence, did his lessons like a machine, spent his free time alone in his room. Edward watched his son with growing desperation. He tried to explain, to justify, to make Thomas understand the needs of their world. He talked about money, about the way society was built, about how slavery was legal and accepted and had existed for thousands of years. He talked about duty and inheritance and the responsibilities of their class, but Thomas would not listen. He had seen the truth and he could not unsee it. He had understood the horror and he could not unknow it. In September, Edward made a decision. He would send Thomas away to boarding school in Richmond, away from Thornhill and its ghosts, away from Dinina and her dangerous truths, away from the graves in the woods and the questions they raised. Perhaps distance would heal what had been broken. Perhaps Thomas would forget, would learn to accept the world as it was, would grow into the master he was meant to be. But before he could make the plans, something happened that would make all such plans meaningless. September brought cooler weather to Virginia, the first hints of autumn in the air. The tobacco harvest was underway, the enslaved people working long days to bring in the crop before the first frost. The leaves were cut, hung in the curing barns, tended carefully to ensure they dried properly. It was the most important time of the year, the work that would decide whether the plantation made money or lost it. But the work was going slowly, poorly, without proper watching. Edward tried to manage it himself, but he was no overseer. He did not know the details of the work, did not know how to push people to work faster, did not have the presence or the cruelty to command total obedience. The enslaved people worked, but at their own pace. They took breaks when they needed them, helped each other, looked after the elderly and the children without constant watching, without the threat of immediate punishment. They created their own rhythms, their own ways. The work got done, but not as quickly or as well as it would have under Vance's brutal management. Edward watched this with growing frustration, but could not figure out how to fix it. He could not find anyone willing to serve as overseer. He could not manage the work himself, and he could not sell everyone and start over. That would destroy the plantation's value, would leave him with nothing. He was trapped, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his strange, silent life. He went through the motions of daily life, but seemed disconnected from everything around him. He did his lessons with a new tutor, a shy young man from Lynchburg, who lasted exactly 3 weeks before leaving, claiming the mood at Thornhill was heavy, but showed no interest in learning. He ate his meals, but tasted nothing. He slept, but had nightmares that left him screaming in the dark, and he continued to seek out Dinina, continued to ask questions, continued to try to understand the hard to understand. One afternoon in mid-September, Thomas found Dinina in the kitchen garden picking vegetables for dinner. Bess was inside, and they were alone. Thomas sat down on the ground beside her, watching her work. "I have been thinking," he said after a long silence, "about what you said, about how the law says children follow the condition of the mother." Dinina continued picking beans, dropping them into her basket. "Yes, young master. So if a free woman has a child with an enslaved man, the child is free. Yes, but if an enslaved woman has a child with a free man, the child is enslaved." "Yes." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "That is designed to help the masters, isn't it? So they can have children with enslaved women and not have to free them, so they can increase their property." Dinina looked at him, surprised by his understanding. "Yes, that is exactly what it is designed to do. And my grandfather, he had children with enslaved women, with your mother, with others. This was dangerous ground, but Dinina decided to answer honestly. Yes, Ruth was not the only one. So I have uncles and aunts who are enslaved, cousins, half siblings maybe, yes." Thomas picked up a stick and began drawing patterns in the dirt. "And father knows this, yes, and he doesn't care." Dinina chose her words carefully. "I think he cares. I think it bothers him, but he doesn't know what to do about it. The system is bigger than any one person. Your father didn't create it. He just inherited it, like he inherited this plantation. But he could change it. He could free people. He could claim his family. He could, but it would cost him everything. His money, his status, his place in society, and it wouldn't change the system. Other plantations would still exist. Other enslaved people would still suffer. Your father freeing his slaves wouldn't end slavery." Thomas threw the stick away. "So we are all trapped. The enslaved people are trapped because they are property, and we are trapped because we benefit from owning them. And we can't give that up without losing everything." "Yes," Dinina said quietly. "That is exactly right. It is evil," Thomas said. "The whole thing is evil, yes." They sat in silence for a while, Dinina picking vegetables, Thomas staring at nothing. Finally, the boy said, "What happened to Samuel? Where did they send him?" "South. That is all I know. The trader was heading to Mississippi or Alabama to the cotton plantations." Will he be all right?" Dinina did not answer immediately. How could she? The cotton plantations were known for their cruelty, for working enslaved people to death and replacing them with new purchases. Samuel was young and strong, which might help him survive, but he was also light, skinned, educated, marked by his likeness to the family that had owned him. "That might make things harder. I don't know," she finally said. "I hope so. I pray so, but I don't know." Thomas nodded slowly. Then he said something that chilled Dinina to her core. "I wish I had never been born. I wish I didn't exist because my existence is part of this. I am part of the evil." "Young master, hush. It is true, I benefit from it. I eat food grown by enslaved people. I wear clothes made by enslaved people. I live in a house built by enslaved people. Everything I have, everything I am is built on their suffering. And someday I am supposed to inherit all of this, supposed to become the master, supposed to continue it. He looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. I don't want to. I don't want any of it. I would rather die than become what my father is, what my grandfather was. Don't say that. Dinina said urgently, you are young. You can choose differently. You can be different. Can I? Or am I already too spoiled, already too much a part of it? Dinina did not have an answer for that. She just continued picking vegetables, and Thomas sat beside her in silence. Both of them trapped in a system neither had created but both were part of. That night, Edward Fairchild sat in his study drinking whiskey and going through Horace Vance's personal items. After the overseer's death, his belongings had been packed up and stored in a trunk in the attic. Edward had finally decided to go through them looking for what? He didn't know. Answers, maybe understanding. The trunk held the usual things: clothes, a razor, a pipe, some money. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, Edward found a small leather journal. He opened it and began to read. The journal was Vance's private record kept over many years. It contained notes about the plantation's work, thoughts about the enslaved people, records of punishments given. But it also contained something else, a careful record of bloodlines. Vance had kept track of which enslaved children had been fathered by which white men. He had noted family looks, recorded births, tracked family connections, and he had paid close attention to the children of the old master, Edward's father. As Edward read, a picture emerged that made his blood run cold. Samuel was not the only child his father had fathered with enslaved women. There had been others, many others. Over the course of 30 years, the old master had fathered at least a dozen children with enslaved women on the plantation. Some had died young. Some had been sold away, but several were still at Thornhill, working in the fields, living in the quarters, bearing the Fairchild blood in their veins. Edward recognized some of the names. Peter, who worked in the blacksmith shop, he was Edward's half-brother. Mary, who worked in laundry, she was Edward's half-sister. Jacob, the old man who tended the horses, he was Edward's half-brother, older than Edward himself. The plantation was full of